welcome read for our kickoff. So at the end of this event, you guys are all going to get your books, which is your free copy thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the big fat grant we got. So we have the free books, either of March Book 3 or previously owned Nathan McClain's poetry collection. And so today I'm very happy to welcome Professor Hank Williams, who's from Lehman College, which is, one of the senior colleges of City University. So they're in the CUNY family along with us here at Queensborough Community College. And he's a professor in the Department of Africana Studies. So let's give it up for Professor Williams.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I was telling Professor Cunahan before we started that because of this, you've let me tick one more CUNY campus off my list. So I've now been to every single one except the new law school. CUNY went and cheated me. I went to the old one that was not too far away, and then they moved it. So now I have to make it over to the new one. But really happy to be out here. Always happy to spend some time with CUNY family. I like to say I'm kind of a 2.5 generation CUNY grad. My dad went to City College. My sister went to City College during the open admissions period. I went to City College because I hadn't had enough of public education. I then did some master's work at City College and went to the CUNY Graduate Center. So we're basically, my family is basically full CUNY. Oh, yes, and I have a grandnephew now going to Lehman College. Has not taken any courses with me yet, but we'll work on that. So I appreciate you all coming, and we have to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Male Resource Center here for helping make this possible too. So what I want to talk about today is less very strictly about March Book 2, because you're going to be covering that in your classes, and it's a fantastic book, fantastic story. But what I want to talk a little bit more about is what creates that. Why march? Why protest? Why does that happen during that time period? So, when I teach literature courses, I usually tell students to think in broad areas. I say, think form, content, and context, right? So think form in terms of the structure of what you're reading. Think content, what is it about? And think context, right? What can we connect it to? What resonance does it have on our lives? What can we connect it to historically? And I don't have the slide here, but the simple explanation I have for context, is probably best expressed by the late, great Marvin Gaye, who had a fantastic 1970s album titled What's Going On? And that's probably the simplest way to understand context. What's going on at the time that something was created, what's going on inside it, and what's going on right now at the time that we actually read or consume a book or any sort of creative expression, because that's something, obviously, that the creator has no control over, but that has possibly the biggest impact of all. So that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about context of the 1950s and 1960s, some of the historical markers, and as you can see, some of the expressions from artists. And I have a few examples from visual artists and a couple of musicians that I'd like us to go through. And then maybe we can talk a little bit, or people will have questions or just want to share their stories or something like that. So first, let's get a quick sense of nomenclature or names or that kind of thing. And when we talk about this time period surrounding March, and we'll get to that a little more specifically in a little bit. It's generally a roughly 2-decade window, as you can see. 1955 to 65, seen by a lot of historians as what we know as the Civil Rights Movement, And the second decade, 1965 to 1975, is the Black Power movement. Sometimes you'll hear them all put together as the long civil rights movement, which is how my colleague Robin Spencer up at Lehman College likes to refer to it. And I'm not going to, some of it is semantics, so I'm not really going to go into the particulars between all of them. I don't particularly lean one way or another, but just so you know, because you might hear one or the other or both, so we can keep it clear. And here are a few framing events. So again, context, right? What's going on in the world? Nothing happens in isolation. And the other thing I'll say is that it is sometimes very difficult, if not impossible, to back map, okay, when does this particular historical period start or end? What is it that actually kicks it off? And my point of view on that is it's somewhat of a fool's errand to do it because stuff doesn't work that way. You might ask, what was it 3 or 4 years ago that kicked off the summers of unrest we had? And, you could very well point to the murder of George Floyd. You could very well point to people being cooped up during COVID. A lot of the time, it's a whole lot of things that just kind of contribute to getting things to a point where all you need is a spark and people turn out. And that's part of what I'm going to argue, or at least suggest here, that you have a lot of events that basically create the spark that begin to drive people into the events that we know very well. So big picture things are Great Migration. So hundreds of thousands, well, millions of African Americans moved from the south to the north during roughly the first 60 to 70-ish years of the 20th century, give or take. And there are a variety of reasons for that. They often talk about push-pull factors, meaning being pushed from the south by the oppressive conditions down there, and also being pulled to the north by the lure of better jobs, possibly better educational opportunities, possibly better housing, all those sorts of things. In reality, it turned out to be a little bit of a mixed bag, and not quite that simple, as we'll see in a few minutes. But that's one big thing. I have World War II down here, and the end of World War II and World War II itself does a few things. Number one, it creates this renewed spark for all of the places on the African continent, Central and South America, and Asia to begin, to sort of renew, throwing off the legacy of colonialism. And, so very literally, that means the independence of Jamaica, where my mother's from, in 1963. That means, that means the Cuban Revolution, which is successful in 1960, as you see down there at the bottom. Ghana on the African continent, gets its independence in 1957. We could go through a whole lot more of those, but hopefully you just kind of get the idea from a few examples. But one of the things that's happening because of the communication technology that's coming around is that people are increasingly learning about these things as they're happening in real time. And additionally, they're also increasingly able to see images of exactly what's going on, and that inspires people all over to think, wow, we could do that too. And there are also affirmative connections between all of these movements that are going on. And I'll just I won't go through all of these, but I'll just focus on a couple more of these that will lead us into talking a little bit more about March. The Brown versus Board of Education case, which most of you have probably heard of, maybe in some cases probably in very broad outlines. Long story short, is it outlaws segregation, in at least in the beginning in schools, but that begins to spread just about everywhere else, and has ripple effects. The other pieces that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on are the lynching of Emmett Till and the sit-in movements. So there you see, and I guess there probably should be a warning on that, but there you see before and after of Emmett Till as it appeared in Jet magazine at the time, which Jet was this very small magazine, kind of about the size of a paperback book that you went into almost any black household, like in the mid 20th century, they would have piles of Jet magazines. We had a bunch, and after I went to graduate school, I kind of realized exactly what they were. And of course, my mom has sort of fought the pack rat gene all her life, and that stuff was long gone. But Emmett Till is a 13-year-old boy from Chicago, gets sent down to Mississippi in kind of a common practice that up till when I was growing up, and probably still is done. People in the North would send their children back south so during the summer, so you get a little break from the city, you get to be reconnected with the family, you get to have that connection with the soil. It's actually something I still see, at least in my neighborhood, commonly done. There are a couple Dominican families in my building, a couple of Puerto Rican families where the kids disappear like in mid-July, and they come back about 2 weeks at the end of August. Much browner. The accent is different, and okay, went back to the home country. So still none. At any rate, that was what they did. His mother sent him down there. And Till is kind of drilled, at least as much as you can for a 13-year-old, in terms of how things work in the South. But it's really kind of hard to warn somebody of, it's an alien type thing in terms of the level of danger, and for just very simple things that happens. So make a long story short, there is some kind of interaction between him and the white clerk in a convenience store. I mean, think essentially about the southern equivalent of a corner bodega, if you put that down in Money, Mississippi. We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that Till had a problem with stuttering or something like that. But at any rate, the woman claims that Till whistled at her or propositioned her or something like that, and her husband and brother-in-law end up picking him up and basically torturing him to death over the course of a night about a week later. And they end up disposing of his body, weighting it down, throwing it in the river. And eventually they find the body, put the people on trial. They do put the people on trial. They're acquitted fairly quickly. And Till's body is returned up to Chicago, where his mother, Mamie Till, does the courageous thing of insisting on an open casket funeral for her son. She says, "Let the world see what they did to my boy." Reason I put that up there is that kind of has a resonance across, if you talk to almost anybody in that age group who was growing up at that time, yeah, they'll say Emmett Till. It just has that sort of indelible image on people, and and the news begins. The news is broadcast internationally, so that kind of blows up the United States on a world stage in not very good ways. So one of the responses you begin to get to that, because people are beginning to think, okay, well, I mean, they've actually been thinking for a long time. We need to do something. We need to do something about this. But that begins to get much more, into a much more organized collective way of confronting it in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Here, I'm actually showing you an album cover from drummer Max Roach's ensemble, but this drops in 1960, at the very same time that the sit-in movement is going on, and that gets kicked off by some college students. I mean, literally your age, actually probably a little younger than some of you, but it gets kicked off by some college students who, literally think, okay, well, what can we do? Well, we can go down and sit at this lunch counter, until they serve us or throw us out. And, of course, they end up doing that, don't get served, eventually leave, go back, eventually get thrown out. But it just metastasizes like across the country. And of course, this is long before TikTok or any of those sorts of things. But it's the type of thing where people realize, okay, I can actually get involved in this, and the barrier to entry is almost zero. So it has a good bit of resonance. But I put this up here instead of a picture of the actual students there, in terms of thinking about how artists are in connection with what's going on in the struggles, because this happens in real time. So it's basically the equivalent of if somebody dropped an album on Black Lives Matter, like just after George Floyd got killed, or something like that. It's that instantaneous, and things don't happen quite that fast at this time. So the point is, they have their fingers firmly on the pulse of what's going on. So one of the outcomes of that, and this is where we begin to zoom in a little bit closer to March, and Baba John Lewis, who you see right there in the picture on the. It's weird because it's reversed on mine. So the big picture on your left in the top, next to SNCC, there you see him speaking at the March on Washington in August 1963. Lewis's speech is probably one of the more militant and fiery ones there, and that's a compromise, because everything is being very, very tightly negotiated. So the speech that he was originally presented to read, which, and this is kind of a minor thing, but was written collectively by SNCC. So Lewis didn't write the speech himself, but the speech that he originally wanted, he was originally slated to present, basically got nixed. They said, no. That is like too militant. You need to tone that down a little bit, and he ends up doing it. But SNCC is one of the outgrowths of the sit-in movement. There's a feeling that, okay, you now have this huge core of students who wants to mobilize, wants to do something, and they should be channeled into an organization. And that's going to kind of reflect their sensibility and how they want to react to these things. And SNCC is basically that outgrowth. So you see John Lewis up there. In the other photo I give you, you see Kwame Ture, possibly better known by some people as Stokely Carmichael, marching along with Dr. King at the March Against Fear, which is just one of the many activities they engage in throughout the South. Thing you have to remember is that we often think about these moments, particularly that moment in terms of the speeches and that kind of thing, the march, the big marches and all that. That's part of it. But SNCC is doing this incredibly dangerous work in the South. The late poet Amiri Baraka, who was a mentor of mine, said, he talked bad about SNCC at first until he kind of realized exactly the type of work they were doing. And SNCC's way of operating was basically by embedding themselves in the people wherever they were trying to organize. So, they wouldn't go hold up in a hotel or whatever. They would basically put people with families. So, family wears overalls, you wear overalls. Family goes to church, you go to church. Family eats cornbread and mustard greens, you go eat cornbread and mustard greens. All that kind of thing, but the point is, their approach was that you really have to get a feel, if you want to actually help them and, create support for them, you really have to get a feel for exactly what people are going through. And you can't really do that by just coming in and going out, because when the lights go down, that's it. It's a totally different type of thing. And some of you may have been in those situations too. If you've been in like rural Dominican Republic or, my case, rural Trinidad or something like that, or way down like in the bayou down south or something, it's a totally different vibe when it gets to be night out there and it is like pitch black. It's like, whoa. And, that's what they're doing. And the problem is they're doing it at a place where the Klan, and that is the Ku Klux Klan and other groups, have no problem bombing people's houses, shooting people up, burying somebody in a shallow grave, any of that kind of thing. So I just say that to give you, sort of a sense of what all this comes out of. And it's gonna keep my eye on time here. So let's take a couple minutes to listen to this, which kind of gives a sense of what they're dealing with. One of the outgrowths of SNCC was a group called the Freedom Singers that went around partially to fundraise, but also partially to join people to the movement by using art and artistic expression. So to do that, I need to get out of here for a moment, go to YouTube, and think about this as you listen to it, and think about the lyrics that you're hearing. No video, by the way, just audio in this one.
In the Mississippi River,
Lord, 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 Lord.
in the Mississippi River,
Lord, 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 Lord.
in the Mississippi River. Well, you can count them one by one. It could be your son. Count them two by two. It could be me or you. Count them three by three. Do you wanna see? Count them 4 by 4. Oh, well, into the river they go. Oh, well, into the river they go. Where you can count them 5 by 5
With their hands
they
tied
don't come out of line,
and their feet tied.
you can count them 6 by 6
Holes throughout their
In
bodies
Mississippi they've got it fixed.
like good
You
money
can count them 7 by 7
and swearing
10. And we wonder when the right will win. And the Mississippi River,
Lord, 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 Lord.
and the Mississippi River,
Lord, 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 Lord.
and the Mississippi.
So I'm going to do the unpardonable thing of fading this out because I'm keeping my eye on the time here. But as you can see, you can go and grab it on YouTube, and it's available on CD from Smithsonian Folkways. I have a couple of these that I play for my classes all the time, and I encourage you to grab some of these things to further immerse yourself in the time period. So, go. So don't know if you heard it, and you would have to be listening very closely. But they mention Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. You see right there in the FBI wanted post. And I also gave you, interesting. I also gave you a clip from our student newspaper up at Lehman, which is named the Meridian, and as you can see, derives its name from Meridian, Mississippi. Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were, essentially ambushed, and they were volunteers working with SNCC, and they were basically ambushed and executed at close range. Cheney got it a little worse. He was the only one who was actually from the South, and they kind of tortured him and messed him up a little bit more before they shot him. But part of the reason that I show this, and I generally show this to my classes, is that we often think that this stuff is far away, and in reality, it isn't. As you can see, our student newspaper at Lehman, dedicated itself to that. But Andrew Goodman was a Queens College student. Michael Schwerner lived up in Pelham, which if you're from Queens or out here, probably don't know spatially, but it's like right just north of the Bronx. I mean, I ride my bike through there all the time. It's like, wow. He grew up right there. So that's one of the things to think about when you're processing this stuff is if you can find sort of a connection or a way in or something that makes it not quite as far away, and often it doesn't take too much digging, that you can do that. So in a little bit of a transition, what begins to happen, and so we've gotten a few examples, both of outrages, both of responses to it, and when you begin to get to the mid-1960s and the Black Power movement, then you begin to get the collection of everything that's been happening, not only over the previous decade, but over the previous half century. And there you see, Amiri Baraka, his wife Amina. Amina is still around. We lost Amiri back in 2014. I think that's his son Obalaji. I'm not remembering exactly which one, but this was something that I heard him say many times. First time I heard him say it was at a conference at Howard University in 2005. He said, what we were trying to do in the 60s was break the hold of white power on our minds. And that was something that kind of resonated with me. But that's one of the things that you begin to see emerging in terms of black people beginning to ask the question, who are we going to be? And who's going to define us? Are we going to do it? Or are we going to let everybody else do it? Are we going to let the crazy Tarzan movies that they have in the theaters do it? Or are we going to try to reach a consensus ourselves? And you begin to see a lot of outgrowths of that, and that kind of radiates with people all across the spectrum. For instance, listen to this very short clip from the singer Nina Simone.
I think what you're trying to ask is why am I so insistent upon giving out to them that blackness, that black power, that black pushing them to identify with black culture. I think that's what you're asking. If I have no choice of it in the first place, to me, we are the most beautiful creatures in the whole world, black people. I mean that in every sense, outside and inside. And to me, we have a culture that is surpassed by no other civilization. We don't know anything about it. So again, I think I said this before in the same interview. I think sometime before. My job is to somehow make them curious enough, or persuade them by hook or crook, to get more aware of themselves and where they came from and what they are into and what is already there, just to bring it out. This is what compels me to compel them. And I will do it by whatever means necessary.
And if we had a little bit more time, I would play you something from Mama Nina, but you can go find that yourself. Put it on your listening lists. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time. So part of that, and something I talked about before is this reestablished and heightened connection with the African continent, in conjunction with trying to figure out, okay, who are we going to be? And how are we going to define ourselves, outside of how that has been given to us? And you get a couple of examples there. You see El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, probably better known to most of you as Malcolm X, there with Maya Angelou when two of them were on the continent together. Below that, you see an artistic group, the AJAS. That is AJASS, African Jazz and Art Society. They had an offshoot titled the Grandassa Models. There's actually a good bit going on about them right now. There was a really good exhibit on them at New York Historical Society, let's say last year or something like that. But again, part of that is that whole question of how are we going to decide who we are on our own terms? And some of that is coming out of and actually developing at the same time as marching, protest, and some of these other struggles. Other thing that develops are urban rebellions throughout the country. In roughly the last half decade of the 1960s. First one was up in Harlem that spread to Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, and as you can see, there are literally hundreds of them throughout the 1960s, and as you can see there's a total of 150 cities in 1960, in 1 year, like 1967 alone. So, you imagine, if you can imagine the type of outrage that there was just a few years ago here, but magnified nationally. And one very important point before we go away from this, all of them are sparked by an incidence of police brutality. So either the police shot somebody or they beat them up, or sometimes people just thought somebody was killed because they took them into the police station and didn't let them out or something like that. But that is kind of the common spark that sparks everything. So why do I put that in? Because marching is of course one outgrowth of this, but there are several others when you don't provide any kind of pressure valve and you don't listen to people who are basically tired of oppression. By the way, if you see in the bottom photo, that was generally how the response was. National Guard troops tended to be called out with literal tanks. By that I mean, tanks like you see on TV now in the war between Ukraine and Russia. They were rolled out in Newark, a whole lot of other places. You see Amiri Baraka up there, bandaged after he was pulled out of his car by police and beaten. Amiri said he was convinced he would have been killed and they would have beat him to death if somebody didn't come by and recognize him while they were beating him. Amiri was well known in Newark, and when my partner and I went to his memorial, it was kind of wild because they had police there with horses and all this kind of thing, and we're kind of walking up there and thinking, uh-oh. And then people who are Newark residents said, no, they're out there for respect, and they were. Crazy how times can change. Those are the Grandassa models again. I'm going to skip through a couple of these, but I put these up there just, again, to begin to show you the evolution, even in iconography, on, how artists are basically projecting their image. So here, you get a couple of different releases from drummer Max Roach. And you see down there, bottom left corner, it's time. Meaning, which has double meanings, right? It's time. It's like we've been protesting and marching enough. It's time. Come on with it. And you see him, donning same glasses, same haircut as Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. And that is Abby Lincoln. You see her there, 1957, beginning of her career, kind of standard lounge singer. And you see how she's looking in 1968. So I want to do a little something with this. I think I'll stop in the interest of time, because I see we're at 36 minutes, and gonna try and keep it to 40 minutes. But that is a painting by artist Faith Ringgold, still around with us, by the way, the mother of one of my professors, Michelle Wallace, and she just had kind of a couple major shows, but her response to it, to the situation which was getting so out of hand in the late 1960s, was to paint this. Die. And the thing is, projecting it doesn't really do it justice. When I walked in and saw it in the new museum, I mean, the thing is enormous. It's like the size of a wall. And, and it just stopped people in their tracks. So why march? What did we get out of it? And protest and organize. Well, one, where I teach right now, Black Studies departments, Puerto Rican Studies departments. Oh, I should have put down Medgar Evers and York colleges. Those would not exist were it not for the student protests in the 1960s. Open admissions in CUNY. I am not ashamed to say that I am one of the last true cohort of open admissions that went through City College. I tell students all the time, I literally would not have gotten into Lehman, right now teach, which is kind of wild, with my GPA in high school. I just didn't have it together then. But, a lot of us think that that's actually the job that we should be doing. And basically, instead of just cherry picking certain students, taking students who kind of don't have the obvious ability, but can come in and do the work. And, I was able to do the work well enough to get through graduate school, and, New York State still pays me to teach. Not a whole lot, but they pay me. The SEEK program, Studio Museum in Harlem, Congressional Black Caucus, you, me, As I said, I wouldn't, without open admissions, I would probably not have gotten into City College. I certainly would not be teaching where I am right now. A lot of you probably would not be here either. So, as we come to a close and try to wrap up, one of the questions always is, what's the use of history? It's this old stuff, happened already, it's in the past, and part of that's true. But the question is, what do you do with it? And the answer to that comes from the late Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who taught at Hunter College, where he says, history is not everything, but it's a starting point. It's a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It's a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. So the idea is that a good grasp of history and the lessons taken properly sort of orients you. It gives you a sense of where you are in the world, what came before, and what's to come after, and how we confront it, which is the key thing of all this. So I'm going to stop right here, but here are some things that maybe we can reflect on. What does all this mean to you? How are you going to respond? How's your generation going to meet the challenges we have? And we have some big ones. If we don't figure out how to stop cooking the earth, then none of us are going to be here, because we are on a planet that is unfortunately very good at getting rid of invasive species. And that's it. Let's talk.